Stop readings.
Should women teach Christian doctrine to men in the church? Those who believe they should not often cite 1 Timothy 2:11-14 to support their position. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. For some interpreters, this text constitutes a universal prohibition on women's teaching men. If Paul did not permit a woman to teach, they say, we shouldn't either. Did Paul intend to prohibit all women everywhere from teaching? Finding an answer will involve examining the context. We could begin with the first two verses of this chapter. There, Paul encourages the believers under Timothy's care to pray for all people, specifically for those in positions of authority. This will contribute to a goal common to all believers, namely, that of living a peaceful and quiet life. The adjective translated quiet in verse 2 is hesukias. Unlike the word sigao, which we encountered in a previous video while examining 1 Corinthians 14:34-35, hesukias does not mean to be silent in an absolute sense. Rather, hesukias describes a state of tranquility or restfulness. In fact, the verb form of this word is used in Acts 11:18 and 21:14 to describe people who are in the act of speaking. In other words, it is possible to be quiet in this sense and be talking at the same time. Paul uses the same word in 1 Thessalonians 4:11 to encourage all believers, both men and women, to aspire to live quietly. This is important to note because the noun form of this same word appears in verse 11 of the passage we are examining. There Paul writes, let a woman learn quietly, ein hesukia, with all submissiveness. If we were to jump right to 1 Timothy 2:11 without observing how this word is used elsewhere in the New Testament, we might conclude that Paul only expected women to be quiet. But actually, quietness is a basic Christian virtue commendable to both men and women who aspire to godliness. In verses 3-7, Paul connects believers' quiet and peaceful lives to glorifying God, who, he says, desires that everyone be saved. Here we see that a quiet, hesukias life is directly related to evangelism. After verse 7, Paul begins to address men and women separately. However, in each case, we can readily see that all the instructions given to each gender group separately could just as rightly be applied to both together. Paul addresses the men in verse 8. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Of course, by telling men to lift their hands and pray, Paul is not saying women should refrain from lifting their hands or from praying. Further, even though Paul tells the men specifically to stave off anger and quarreling, it does not follow that women, therefore, ought to be angry and quarrelsome. Why is this? It's because even though Paul is applying these principles to the gender separately, the principles themselves are grounded in the example of Christ. Therefore, they apply to all Christians. The same can be said of verses 9-10, which address the women. Likewise also the women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. Likewise here, even though Paul is talking specifically to women, he would certainly have forbidden men from dressing indecently or immodestly if he had seen the need. By analogy, imagine a teacher who tells a chatty group in her classroom, boys, please be quiet. Raise your hand if you want to say something. In singling out the boys, the teacher does not mean that the girls should start talking amongst themselves or that the girls do not need to raise their hands if they want to say something. To summarize, all of Paul's instructions in verses 8-10 can be equally applied to both genders because they are all based on basic principles of Christian conduct. Now, if this is the case for verses 8-10, is it also true of verses 11-12? Let's look first at verse 11. Paul tells women specifically to learn quietly with all submissiveness. Right away we can see that this is good advice for any learner. Any experienced teacher would agree that rowdiness, loudness, or rebelliousness makes students very difficult to teach. But Paul's command to women here is not based only in general advice for students, for as it turns out, quietness and submissiveness are actually Christian virtues in themselves as well. In fact, as we noted before, Paul uses the word here translated quiet, hesukia, to describe the Christian life generally in verse 2 of this same chapter. Likewise, Paul tells all Christians to submit to one another in Ephesians 5:21. In the same spirit, Philippians 2:4 says, "Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." The idea of mutual service permeates the whole New Testament, and of course, mutual service requires mutual submission. Like quietness, submissiveness is also a Christian virtue not only for women, but also for men. Verse 11, therefore, can easily be interpreted apart from gender roles, for Paul's advice there certainly applies to men as well as to women. But what about verse 12? There, Paul says that he is not permitting women to teach or to have authority over a man. Is Paul introducing gender roles in verse 12? Some interpreters say yes. They argue that Paul's reference to Adam and Eve in verses 13 to 14 is an allusion to a created order or hierarchy in which God made the man to be an authority over the woman at creation. There are at least three critical problems with this interpretation. First, there is nothing in the text of Genesis 1 and 2 that even hints at a created hierarchy between man and woman at creation. To the contrary, the first two chapters of Genesis emphasize repeatedly the complementarity and equality of male and female in creation, as we will see in a future video. Second, this interpretation would imply an awkward break from the previous context. As we have noted, all of Paul's instructions to men and women in the previous verses are based not in gender roles, but on generally encouraged Christian virtues. If Paul is introducing gender roles in verse 12, this would constitute an abrupt departure from this pattern. Of course, it is possible for Paul to break such a pattern, even in an abrupt or awkward manner. But before drawing such a conclusion, interpreters should see if there is a way to interpret verse 12 that harmonizes better with the context. In this case, such an interpretation exists, as we will see in a moment. The third problem with an interpretation of this text based in gender roles is that it runs contrary to human experience. Granted, on the one hand, experience cannot give us the final word on a faithful interpretation of Scripture, but it cannot be ignored on the other hand. Here's the problem. Those who read verse 12 as an instruction based in gender roles consistently cite verses 13 to 14, which refer to the deception of Eve. On such a view, the reason Eve was deceived was because she stepped out of her divinely ordained role as a woman. Rather than submit to Adam's leadership, she became the leader. The woman's femininity in itself makes her more open to deception relative to the man. This view immediately clashes with common experience. First, the majority of heretics and cult leaders that have emerged in the history of the church over the past 2,000 years have been men, not to mention dictators and tyrants. This fact would seem to lead one to doubt that men are intrinsically less vulnerable to deception than women. Further, in relation to men, women are disproportionately involved in Christian education of children in the church throughout the world, and no Christian would argue that women should not teach children. But if it is true that women are naturally more vulnerable to deception than men, it would be nonsensical and even foolish for churches to recruit women to teach children in Sunday school, for all would agree that children are especially impressionable. Thus, reading 1 Timothy 2:12 through the lens of gender roles is fraught with problems. Is there a better reading of this text, one that avoids these problems? Yes, there is.
Sharp readings.